Good evening, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives. It's been a few weeks since we've been able to do a Sunday night broadcast. We miss our friend Ellis Winningham. Hopefully he'll be back in the future soon. But in the meantime, though, we figured we'd kick off our Sunday nights with a guest that everyone knows well, Dr. Bill Mitchell. Dr. Bill Mitchell is one of the gentlemen whom I have found the closest relationship to in terms of the way they view the economy as well as their political bend. And it's Bill Mitchell's blog, the Billy blog, that has given me so much information, so much of the background that I use to bring you all the information that Real Progressives brings. So without further ado, let me bring on our guest, Dr. Bill Mitchell. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks very much, Steve.
I got to tell you, it was an amazing opportunity. I know that you're an economist, but to me, you're a hero. To be able to meet with you and to watch you play your guitar and to experience just being around you in your element was a tremendous honor. I was so grateful to be a part of the UMKC, World Conference of Modern Monetary Theory. What were your thoughts about that?
Well, it was a very interesting exercise. The numbers were great. I think there was around 250 people there, and that's pretty good for what we might term to be a fringe academic conference. But I'd say more than that is that two other things that I noticed. One was that unlike other academic conferences, and I'll qualify that term in a moment, it wasn't just about economics. There were other disciplines represented, all buying into the exercise. So we had panels from lawyers, from environmental scientists, and from people in the humanities. I thought the humanities panel was fantastic. And so that's quite a difference, because economists are well known for having the lowest cross-social science citation rate among social scientists. We have a very insular approach to our academic endeavours, and it closes our minds. And so I thought that opening up was a real plus. And the other thing I noted was that it wasn't strictly an academic conference. There were people like yourself who are active in the field of policy advancement, advocacy, and for a more progressive world. And there was a sizable proportion of people of that ilk. That meant that we had a very nice conversation between academic types across all the social sciences, plus non-academic types who we rely, as academics, I rely on people like yourself to advocate the ideas that the academics develop. And I thought that was fantastic, and it's got great potential.
So without going too far into this, I wanted to make the point that you wrote a phenomenal book. I had the pleasure of reading it before it came out, and Reclaiming the State. This, for me, as exactly Reclaiming the State. I think it's very important for people to understand that as much as we talk about MMT, and there's groups out there that like to dust off the glass of the MMT showcase at the museum, but you're someone who sees this in its practical application. You're someone who sees this as how it impacts individuals, how it impacts our lives, our families, our countries. And you've taken a very, very pointed political stand here, which I respect to the utmost. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective here, sir?
Well, quite often, and I'm sorry for my coughing, I've had a flu since America, but quite often I will say to people give the impression when we're talking about MMT that it's if only we have MMT, if only we move to MMT, as if it's some sort of regime that we're going to transit to from this neoliberal era. And the point I often make is that we've already got MMT. MMT is a lens in which we view the monetary system and understand it and appreciate the capacities that the currency issuing government has, or what will happen if a government restricts its currency issuing capacities, such as in the Eurozone. And so MMT is just this, what I would think to be a superior lens to understanding the way the system actually operates and the opportunities that the system presents a government. But that only takes you so far, and to give that traction or to make that useful, you then have to impose a value system on top of that understanding. What are your values? What's your worldview? And depending upon, and another way of saying that is that a right winger, a so-called neoliberal could ascribe to, have the same lens as I have with respect to MMT, but come up with quite different policy designs. And the beauty of, I think, having a broader understanding of modern monetary theory is that it really lifts what I call the veil of ideology. And so, for example, a politician who was introducing policies that had no hope of achieving full employment or prosperity for the poor in the society in question could no longer say, oh, well, we haven't got enough money, we can't afford to create jobs. Because if everyone in the society understood modern monetary theory, they'd know that was a straightforward lie. And so, in my view, broadening the educational remit of MMT, helping more people embrace the understanding and adopt the lens, is a source of improving our democracies. That people will have a much better chance of arguing against politicians and their lobby groups who want to tell us lies about the policy options. So what you have to do is impose that value system. And what Reclaiming the State is about is my value system, and Thomas Farzi, who's my co-author in that exercise, it's an imposition of our value system on what we think should be done, given that we understand what the state can do, given that we understand modern monetary theory.
That's fantastic. So when we look at, the question that I think most of our audience is interested in knowing is, what can we as activists do with this knowledge? How does our being educated in this information change society, change government, change what they are willing to do?
Well, what we argue in Reclaiming the State is that at key turning points in history, and we look at the mid-1970s with the British Labor government, and where they claimed they had to borrow money from the IMF because they'd run out of money. And then the so-called austerity turn of Francois Mitterrand in 1983, which was, Mitterrand was elected in 1983 on a very ambitious socialist agenda as a response to almost a decade of hardship imposed upon the French people by Raymond Barre, who was the finance minister in the conservative regime that preceded Mitterrand. And this was a typical neoliberal. He was the first monetarist neoliberal, really, before Thatcher. And Mitterrand was elected by a electorate that was extremely disenchanted with the high unemployment. The neoliberal monetarist regime hadn't achieved its agenda of controlling inflation. And Mitterrand was elected on a very ambitious agenda to restore prosperity, create work, enhance industry and whatever. And within a very short time, he was completely taken over by neoliberals, and Jacques Delors was his finance and economy minister, and he had become a monetarist by then. And so what we saw in these historical episodes was the left basically buying the neoliberal agenda that the state was subjugated by global financial interests. And if it dared do anything that was contrary to what the big investment banks and the hedge funds and what have you desired, then those global financial interests would close the government down and send it bankrupt. And this became the sort of mainstream left mantra, the progressive mantra. And so what you saw was a sequence of governments, socialist parties, social democratic parties, Labor parties, Democrats in the US, all adopting this line that the nation state was weak now, that it had to adopt conservative economic policies to allay the global financial markets and all the rest of that narrative that we've still got today. But the right adopted a different view. It knew very well that it had to achieve its agenda through the state. It understood that the state was not weak at all, that short of raising an army and invading countries, the right had to introduce its agenda explicitly through the state by reconfiguring the state. And so if you go through all of the neoliberal policy changes, the privatisations, the outsourcing, the deregulation of financial markets and labour markets, the fiscal rules, the depoliticisation of fiscal policy, the rise of technocrats, the rise of central banks being the only credible aggregate economic policy unit. All of those things have worked through the state being co-opted and persuaded to make the changes through legislation and rules. And so what we argue in Reclaiming the State is that the left has to become smart again. It has to work out that once it understands that all of those stories about the financial market sending governments who issue their own currencies broke are false. Once you understand that a government who issues its own currency can buy whatever is for sale in its own currency, including all idle labour, which means that therefore mass unemployment is a political choice, not a financial imperative. Once you understand that the government can employ all idle labour if it wants to, and can do more than that, can enrich our education and health systems, and can re-regulate, can have industry policies, can re-regulate the financial markets, can impose capital controls, and a whole range of other things that the legislative power of the state allows, then there's no reason for these progressive parties to buy that neoliberal line. And as citizens who vote and who are members of parties or seek to bring pressure on those parties, then that we've got to adopt this line that we have to reclaim the state for progressive purposes and force our politicians to adopt progressive policies and stop telling us lies about the incapacity of the state to act in our interests.
So this brings me to another concern. Our progressive media is largely just saying neoliberal nonsense. One of your videos, you had done a talk where you said many progressives are actually neoliberals. Can you explain the difference between what a progressive is and what a neoliberal is?
Well, I mean, I use the term neoliberal in terms of the economic statements that are made. And I say that, say, for example, the Greens Party in Australia, I call them neoliberals on bikes. And what I mean by that is that their social and environmental agendas are first class. They believe in equity. They believe in the state regulating for climate change. They believe in providing opportunities to people in lower income groups. They believe in a whole range of what we might call identity issues. So same-sex marriage, equal opportunity for women in the workplace, and a whole range of other what I call progressive stances. But then they, in the same breath, they reiterate the stories that, the government's got to run fiscal surpluses, or it'll run out of money. The government's got to have lower debt, or else it might endanger the future generations, their prosperity, and all of this other stuff that is straightforward mainstream economics nonsense. It's fake knowledge, but they reiterate it in their public statements. And so I call them neoliberals on bikes. And the analogy extends to all of these so-called progressive parties. Like, listening to Hillary Clinton talk during the presidential campaign about economics was straight neoliberalism. It was straight belief in this false view that the so-called free market will deliver prosperity to all, that trickle-down economics, all of those ideas are straight neoliberalism. And no matter what she said about anything to do with equity or climate change or any of the rest of it, which may have been progressive, the bottom line is that you can't achieve those progressive ideals if at the same time you're adopting macroeconomic policies that constrain the capacity of the government to do anything much. And so what's progressive is a difficult thing to nail down explicitly, but it's about a concern for equity. I mean, my view is that you judge policy by how rich it makes the poorest person in the society, not by how rich it makes the richest person. And so, progressive policies include a responsibility for creating jobs for all, wage fairness, policies that are open to providing opportunities to the poorest persons in the society. That's what I think is a progressive person espouses and believes that the state has a unique capacity to make those things happen. The market will never make those things happen. It's not an adequate vehicle for doing any of that.
Okay. So quick question. When you're looking at American views of what progressive is versus what your views of being a progressive might be, you realize that much of America is still infested and infected by Milton Friedman's view of the world. So much of what Milton Friedman said, basically his entire approach to quantity theory of money and the way that monetary policy versus fiscal policy, it is still corroding our entire lives every minute of every day. Your book spoke about Uncle Milty and his impact, if you will, on this. Can you talk a little bit about Milton Friedman's impact to what progressives face today as we try to overcome these hurdles?
excuse me. Well, I mean, Milton Friedman has blood on his hands. That's the reality. Um, his view of the world has progressively been adopted by all major political parties, and by the mid 1970s, it was very difficult to find any academic discussion that wasn't reflecting the rising dominance of monetarism. Now, the sort of irony is that the first central bank to try Milton Friedman's policies about monetary targeting. So he had this view that to control inflation, the central bank needed to control the money supply. And as it relates to, as you said, the quantity theory of money, which assumed that the growth of the money supply would be directly translated into growth in prices. And that's because they adopted the ridiculous assumption that the economies were always at full capacity, full employment. And the first government to try that, first central bank, was the Bank of England in 1971 under its credit and competition policy. And they quickly found out within about a year that couldn't be done, that central banks do not control the money supply. The money supply is endogenously created by demand for credit, and that they failed and abandoned that. Now, you might then say, well, how is it that that his ideas continue to spread and eventually soon became the dominant narrative in macroeconomics? And what you learn is that evidence isn't the basis on which mainstream economics decides what they think is knowledge or not. And that's why I say it's fake knowledge, because its evidence base is very weak. Mainstream economics has become a servant of capital, and it's devised a theoretical and policy narrative that supports the shift away from sharing national income towards biasing it towards capital. And monetarism was a vehicle which gave that ambition credibility and substance. And the myth that if we followed monetarist views and allowed, and then its microeconomic companion, the deregulation and privatisation, that would somehow trickle down to the rest of us, is evidentially false. But it continues because the vested interests that fund research and publish it and articulated it back into the mainstream media are all on side because it's serving the interests of capital, and it needs a citizens' revolt to change that.
I love that. Let me ask you another question. I just recently saw Richard Wolff come out, and I don't know if I would call it an endorsement of MMT, but he certainly wasn't discouraging it. Richard Wolff, the Marxist variety. MMT and Marxism don't have conflict necessarily. I mean, it seems like a lot of MMTers come from a Marx background to some extent. Can you talk a little bit about where MMT lies and how it complements or where it goes against Marx?
Well, that's a long answer coming up, but
yes, it is.
Look, it depends what you mean by Marxism. What I take from Marx, and I studied Marx and as a young student and then an academic. What I take from Marx is that the capitalist epoch is built on a inherent conflict between labour and capital, and that with capital being defined as those who own the means of production, that is, having the capacity to create jobs, and labour being defined by the absence of that ownership, that is, then facing an imperative that they have to go and work for a capitalist in order to survive, which is, say, a different arrangement to the previous historical epoch of feudalism, where the worker produced their subsistence outside of the exploitive relationships with the feudal lord on their own little block of land. So capitalism I take to be meaning that, and Marx's insights allowed us to see the implications of that, that inherent conflict between capital and labour would then yield a power relations and a power struggle, not only within the economic sphere, not only within the workplace, which we might summarise as the worker wants to do as little as possible and get as much back for that, and the boss wants the worker to do as much as possible and pay as little to get as much, and that creates a control function, a necessity to control the workplace. So there's all of that industrial control literature. I think that's very illuminating. It is also a struggle outside the workplace at the political level to excuse me, to co-opt any governments to serve one or more interests. And the way I see the post-Second World War period up until the monetarist era in the 1970s was that the state was a mediator within that conflict. The power of the citizens through the ballot boxes, and also the historical experience of raw capitalism. I mean, there was a reason why welfare states and trade unions formed in the sort of late 19th century, and that's because the capitalist system was delivering such awful outcomes to the majority of us. It was working for the few, not the many, to paraphrase and reverse Jeremy Corbyn's mantra. But there's a reason why we sought to create political parties that reflected the trade union interests, the so-called social democratic parties. That was because capitalism was so awful for the majority of us. It was delivering such awful workplaces and poor earnings outcomes and all of the rest of that. And so we formed social democratic parties. We formed labour parties as voices for workers. And for a while, those parties mediated the struggle between capital and labour. And this was what I call the full employment era, that real wages grew in line with productivity and allowed workers to share in the growth of real income. And there was legislation to protect workers from capricious employers sacking them, and workplace safety and income support schemes for those who weren't able to work. And that was a very progressive era. Wasn't utopia, but it was progressive. And now what we've seen in the neoliberal era, that political struggle from capital has triumphed, with states now, in my view, becoming an agent of capital rather than a mediator between capital and labour. So for MMT, remember, is just a lens of viewing how the system operates and what the capacity of the government is. And in my view, it's not incompatible with a Marxist leaning on what needs to be done. The state, in my view, needs to be a mediator between capital and labour, not an agent of capital.
Great. So, Dr. Mitchell, another question, and this is kind of a difficult one, because I'm oftentimes stuck in this position where I'm trying to tell Marxists, hey, come on board here, help us win this war by uniting in macroeconomic truth. On the other side, I'm going to centrist Democrats and saying, hey guys, much of what you've known and learned to love is completely FUBAR. Come on over here and help us unite to bring about this progressive agenda. The reality is that you're telling them something so fundamentally different than what they've understood for so long, that you find people within the movement so literally hell-bent on holding on to the economics of our oppressors that they can't make that leap to just see this for what it is. How do you, because you've spoken an awful lot about reframing modern monetary theory, being able to package it and say it differently, what are some of the ways that you would help someone striving for this knowledge that desperately wants a progressive revolution, so to speak? How would you package this in such a way that allows them to take ownership of this knowledge and march it forward?
Well, I haven't been terribly successful at that myself. We've been chipping away at this for years, and we're only just starting to make traction. And we're learning as well as everybody else on how we can spread these ideas. But one thing I think is important is not to conflate the values with the lens. I think that's really critical. The task, there's two tasks. The first task is the educational task, to just ingrain the principles of modern monetary theory, which you can do in a way that doesn't require you to talk about Marx or Friedman or anything else. I think that's the first task, and I think some small stories are the best. Chipping away in a really small way is the way to start. And maybe just the two-person economy. I have a two-person economy story. If I'm just talking to somebody, I say, look, I'm the government. You're a person. You're the non-government. And I say to them, let's play this game. And they look at me, and I say, okay, now you owe me $10 tax. And they look at me, and I say, okay, where is it? And they say, well, how do I pay it? And I said, well, I've got the currency, I'm the government, you've got to pay me $10. And they look at me and they say, well, where am I going to get it from? And that's the first learning experience. You say, okay, well, I'll hire you for $20 an hour or $10, and let's do an hour's work on something. They say, okay, we're playing a mind game. And they immediately understand that I have to spend that currency before they can pay me back in taxes. So Logic 101 then principle is that something that causes something can't come after it. It's got to come before it. And so therefore the taxes can't cause the spending. It's got to the spending causes the taxation capacity. And so you can take that example further, and then I ask them, well, have you been able to save any of my currency this first period? If I've only hired you for 10 and you've paid me 10, they immediately understand they haven't been able to save anything. And so we've got the next principle, and I say to them, well, I've spent 10 and got back 10. If I run a deficit or a surplus, they immediately understand that I've run a balance. And so there's principle number 2. Principle number 1 was that taxes can't cause spending. Principle number 2 is that the government balance is $1 for dollar equal to the non-government balance. We've both run balances. And then the next part of the little game, I tell them, okay, I'll give you $20 this time, but I only tax you 10. So we get the second principle, that a deficit, and then they realise that they've got $10 spare in this little game that they didn't have to pay in taxes because I've given them 20 and done some work advancing well-being. And they immediately get the second principle, or reinforce that second principle, that my deficit is a source of their, and they understand this $10 is now wealth to them. It's a store of wealth. So you build up, that's a very simple way of talking. It's like talking to children, but it's relearning things. We have to start by relearning things that are so ingrained in us. I was at a function on Saturday evening, and these were all very educated, progressive people. And and the sort of things that some of them were saying about government spending being inflationary, governments running out of money, just mind-boggling. And so when you have that level of ingrained fake knowledge, you have to start simple by going back to primary school. And it's not an insult. It's just we learnt language in an elementary way. We learnt concepts in a very elementary way, and we have to go back to primary school. And that's the way I sort of approach it, in a respectful way, but that's the way I do it. And the language we use is very important, as you say. And I'm just learning this myself and trying to work through this myself. I now no longer use the word budget deficit to describe the fiscal balance of a currency issuing government, because that immediately invokes the frame that the government budget is somehow like a household budget, which is one of the primary organising tools of the mainstream to invoke those ideas that the government, our experience as households, is somehow meaningful in understanding the experience of government, which is clearly not. And so I avoid using that term budget. And there's a whole lot of other, I'm moving towards other things. I mean, maybe if we stop using government spending, because spent means exhaustion and nothing left. And maybe we should just use terms like government investment, which means expanding our fortunes rather than spending them off. And so I'm learning those things myself, but it's a real challenge and it's an ongoing journey.
So it's interesting because, whenever Dr. Kelton or yourself or Warren or any of the other headliners in this movement go out there and they do some form of a tweet, it's instantly memorialized into almost a meme, because these short, concise answers do more for us, even if it's just to open the conversation. The article that Stephanie wrote for both the LA Times and the New York Times were like manna from heaven for those of us who are out there on the front line swinging away. Anytime one of these well-written, easy to consume articles comes out, it just gives us, a full 5-course meal of information to dole out to others. You wrote a textbook as well, and I think this is a good transition here. You wrote the very first textbook that was purely from an MMT perspective. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important, what went into it, and what we should be expecting from it? Just
a comment on your use of social media. I think social media has been the vehicle for us taking our academic ideas into the main public debate, and I've commented on that before, and I think that we're increasingly learning that. I mean, we're not experts in communication, of course. We're academics and researchers and teachers, and our communication skills were developed in a specific context rather than, and so we have to learn all of these new ways of communicating and getting messages across. But I think when I started my blog, which was in 2004, it was an early adoption of the technique, pre-Twitter, pre all of those other things. It started to bring our academic work into the main public debate, and I think people like Stephanie are very good at Twitter. I'm less good at Twitter because I'm too verbose, but I'm learning, and I think those things are really good. And it is definitely building the network and bringing together people from my side of the world, like academics, into bringing together with people like you who are advocates and activists. And that twain has to meet and strengthen, and on the progressive side, and that's a great thing. In terms of the textbook, we've already got an introductory textbook out that we put out earlier for a teaching program at my university. But now we've completed the manuscript for the next version, which is a 2-year university sequence in explicitly written in an unapologetic manner from an MMT perspective. It's from Randy Ray, myself, and Martin Watts. Macmillan will be publishing that. They're the largest textbook publishers in the world. They're publishing that in April 2018. And the fact that Macmillan has taken it up is an extremely significant move in my view, because, as I said, they're the largest textbook publisher in the world. They're a commercial publisher, and they won't publish anything they can't make a buck on, or think they can make a buck on. Whether they do is another question, but they've obviously assessed that, and our approach is unapologetic. I mean, it's not a sort of a mainstream book with a bit of MMT in it. It's front and centre MMT. We don't adopt the view of where we trot out the neoliberal or the mainstream macroeconomics and then have a critique of it. We largely avoid that approach, and there are certain elements of mainstream macroeconomics in there, mostly as his history of economic thought, to make sure that our students understand the context in which we're writing, rather than leave them devoid of any historical understanding of where my profession has gone. But it's front and centre MMT. It's a university level text, but as I announced at the UMKC conference a few weeks ago, we're starting what we're calling an MMT university, and this will be an institution, an online institution that will provide educational courses in modern monetary theory. Some of those courses will be based upon the textbook, so they'll provide university level education for those that wish to engage at that level. But we'll also be providing other courses which we might call, and with respect, primary school MMT courses. So very, very introductory courses. Some of them will be just short courses, but they'll be short. They'll be at a level which will allow people to progress intellectually up to the university level courses, even if they've never had a university or college in your context education. And so I think that that's going to help us expand the informed populace, because one of the problems is that we don't want MMT to become a sort of popularized story where corners are cut on what's correct, what are correct statements and what are not. So we've been talking about a quality assurance framework to make sure that when people are saying they are representing MMT, then what they're doing is really advancing the ideas and not involving themselves in fictions. And so the MMT University will be a vehicle to engage with those who want the most basic introduction through to those who want to have a university level. Now, it's not going to offer awards at this stage, but I'm hoping over time we'll be able to articulate formal arrangements with existing university programs where they credit students who have done the MMT courses with credits within a formal university program elsewhere.
Very good. So one of the questions that I think comes up nearly all the time is inflation, the concerns of inflation, traditional sources of inflation. Typically the word printing money comes up. We realize that that's not really the case. The real case has to do with resources and the availability of resources on demand. Can you talk a little bit, if you were presenting to a government that was really taking a serious consideration of MMT, how they might view the role of resources, inflation, and spending, that relationship there? Could you frame that for us?
If I can, it's often stated by critics of MMT, and what's happening over the last year or maybe 2 years is that the number of critics is growing, and I think that's a great thing, because that means that the period in which people just ignored us is over. And when you've got people criticising you, it means that they're seeing it as a threat to their own particular worldview. So I think that's good. But one of the things that they, short put downs is, MMTs think that fiscal deficits are unlimited, and that there's no constraint on the size of a fiscal deficit that a government can run. And they say that because they then invoke all of this stuff about inflation and running out of money and all of that. Now, it's totally false. None of the main MMT academics have ever said anything remotely like that fiscal deficits are unlimited. What we say, or what I say, is that a currency issuing government can buy whatever is for sale in its own currency, and that's the limit. And when you think about it like that, there's no financial constraint on governments doing that, because that government issues its own currency. But what the constraint that the government that issues its own currency faces is a real resource constraint, as you pointed out. And real resources are capital and labour and land and the things that go into production. And if a government desires, has the political will, it can ensure that all idle productive resources are brought back into productive use in one form or another. But it can't do more than that. And if it tries to spend beyond the amount of spending that's required to bring those resources back into production, then of course it's going to be adding inflationary pressures. And so the inflation constraint is the available real resources that can be purchased with the government's currency. And so that tells you what the limit on the fiscal deficit should be if the non-government sector desires to run a surplus. And that is that the government deficit should be such that it makes sure that all idle resources are productively engaged. Not a dollar more than that. And most people say, oh yeah, but if you keep doing that, you'll just eventually get inflation. Well, no, you won't. Because what we know is that population sizes grow and productivity grows. And so the capacity of the real side of the economy, the productive side of the economy, is growing as well. And so that creates an imperative that spending in the economy grows in proportion with that. Because if the productive side, the supply side of the economy is growing, then the demand side has to follow it. Otherwise, you'll get insufficient spending in the economy and a lack of, you'll get unemployment and recession. And so the government can run continuous deficits, and its spending can, in nominal terms, dollar terms, increase continuously without there being inflation, as long as they're sitting within that inflation constraint I mentioned. Now, then the Conservatives wheel out. Well, they used to wheel out the Weimar Republic, but now they've become more modern, and they talk about Zimbabwe. Now, the only relevant thing about Zimbabwe was it was a great song that Bob Marley wrote and sang. But the relevance for inflation and fiscal deficits is virtually zero. And the reason I say that is because, as I've explained in the past, the hyperinflation that Zimbabwe experienced was due to policies introduced by Robert Mugabe to reward his freedom fighters who broke the colonial yoke. And he awarded freedom fighters who were good at shooting up things. He awarded them, gave them land control of farms. Now, the two problems emerged was the farming in Zimbabwe was among the most productive in the world. It was held by whites, owned by whites. And the freedom fighters that took over those farms were not farmers. They were freedom fighters. And so what happened was that productivity and output in Zimbabwe collapsed by up to 60% very quickly. And if you've got a supply contraction of that size, then you'll get hyperinflation almost immediately. And cutting the fiscal deficit wouldn't have helped at all, because just the non-government spending would have driven the hyperinflation. And so when you have a massive supply contraction, same story in Weimar Republic in the 1920s, by the way. When you have a massive supply side contraction, you're going to get hyperinflation. It tells you nothing about ongoing fiscal deficits in a normal economy that's mostly found.
Very good. All right. So my final question, which is going to kind of build on that, goes to the fact that you were dare I say, the father of the job guarantee, in terms of you had talked about the buffer stock for agriculture in Australia. And this is from a conversation you and I had offline. So my question to you is, given that we talk about Weimar and hyperinflations and all these other silly things that are oftentimes brought up to us to kind of slow us down, so to speak. The job guarantee is something that I think is of incredible importance, especially to minorities in the United States who are trapped in areas that are not only not serving their needs, but are leaving them behind. And I'm going to use some terminologies from Ellis Winningham, who usually is on with me. He basically said that the job guarantee allows mobility, which these affected communities never experienced before. Suddenly they can pick up and go wherever they want and have a job the next day, as it is their right to do so, with fringe benefits, etc. This is an incredibly empowering tool for the 99%, which in my opinion is the beginning of flipping neoliberalism on its head. Can you talk a little bit about the job guarantee, its impact on minority communities, and overall why it is so key to understanding MMT?
Well, hopefully I can. I'm not sure I'd call myself the father. I wouldn't call myself the father of job guarantee. Clearly, in this modern era, the terminology, I reintroduced that terminology. Others have talked about this in earlier periods, both the term and the concept. What I think, and Warren and I came to this separately. Warren Mosler had a concept called employer of last resort, and I had a concept called buffer stock employment, BSE. And the reason I changed from BSE to job guarantee was because Britain was enduring the mad cow disease, if you remember, which was called BSE, and I thought that we better not have the job guarantee policy being related to mad cows. But I came on, the idea that I had came about when I was a university student in late 1970s, 1978 to be explicit. And it was in relation to the wool price stabilisation scheme that the Australian government ran. And this was briefly a scheme where they agreed to stabilise prices for farmers so that farm incomes wouldn't have those ups and downs, seasonal ups and downs, and so farmers could plan their lives better. And so whenever the wool clip, the production of wool each year was above amount to stabilise that price, if there was too much wool, the government would agree to buy it all, the surplus. And if the wool clip was deficient, so prices would rise, the government sold the wool clip out of its buffer stocks that it held in big red brick buildings all around Australia. And so I wasn't so much interested in the wool industry at the time I was studying agricultural economics. I was more interested in employment of labour. And it was at a time when unemployment was starting to rise in the late 70s, as it did everywhere. And so I thought that this was a full employment of wool, of labour plan, that the government could buy all the surplus labour that the private sector didn't want, and then at a fixed price, and then stabilise the price, and then release it back into the private sector if and when the private sector was bidding it away and was strong enough to give it work and pay it above that fixed price, which would effectively become the minimum wage. And that's how I got the idea of job guarantee. Warren came through it in a different way, but it's become a centrepiece of what we now call modern monetary theory. And without being too geeky, there's been a major debate in macroeconomics over the years called the Phillips curve debate. And this is the so-called relationship between unemployment and inflation. So Keynesians believed that there was a trade-off, that if you wanted to have less unemployment, you had to tolerate more inflation, and so governments had to make that choice. Monetarists came along and said there was no real trade-off, that there was only one unemployment rate that the market would fix at, which would be consistent with stable inflation, and you had to tolerate that no matter what level. And if it was too high, governments could do nothing about it other than structural change, which really meant deregulation and training and those type of things, the neoliberal era. And what the job guarantee idea does for the Phillips curve debate is it basically renders it irrelevant, because what it shows is that the government can have true full employment with stable inflation by paying a fixed price to any labour unconditionally, to any labour that is not working. And the reason that it basically voids the so-called trade-off between unemployment and inflation is that the government, when it's offering a fixed price, is offering it to anybody who's currently has no bid in the private market. What I mean by that is that the private market doesn't want this resource. They're not prepared to pay a cent for them. That's why they're unemployed. And so the government is not competing with the private sector for any market resource at all. They're buying labour that the market doesn't want. And so that can't be inflationary. And so this I saw this as a very important step in the development of macroeconomic policy and understanding that you no longer had to accept that there was a trade-off or no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. You could have price stability and full employment both together. And how that, to me, that's a very empowering thing for communities, because it recognises that the state has a responsibility for full employment, that that any unemployment is then a political choice, and then citizens have to demand, well, what the hell are you doing if you're just making this political choice? Whose politics are you serving? But moreover, it recognises that the state chooses the unemployment rate and can choose a very low unemployment rate if it desires and we force it to, as through citizens' action. And a low, and the major cause of poverty and dislocation is unemployment. And the job guarantee, as you said, is an empowering policy framework. It gives income security. It's a framework that it could incorporate skill development. It's a framework that can incorporate inclusion of minorities that don't find themselves able to work, and I'm thinking people with disabilities that private sector will never employ, and so the public sector has a flexible framework that can employ people with adequate clinical support as well as the job. It's a regionally specific program, as you mentioned, that it's not a generalised expansion. It provides jobs wherever people are, so it reinforces what I call the economic, the social settlement where people live. It brings the economic settlement where jobs are to where people live, and stops this sort of bleeding of regional areas where there's no industry anymore. And it can also be used as a really powerful force to meet unmet community and environmental needs. And I think it's a really evolutionary framework, which is why I can't understand why progressives have increasingly opted to support basic income guarantees. But I think that's another topic of conversation for us.
Indeed, it is. In fact, that really would be a long conversation right there. So, Dr. Mitchell, I want to thank you. We're at the hour right now. I would love to be able to have you come back on again. You're clearly one of my favorite people. So your time has been very, very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Do you have anything further that you'd like to bring up that's coming up here? I know that you've been traveling quite extensively in support of your book. Is there anything else coming up here that the audience might be of interest?
Look, just follow my blog. You'll see where I am at. I'm sort of all over the place. So, I think my next trip's back to Italy in December. We're talking to some major progressive politicians and helping them reframe their policy debates. So we'll see what happens. But just keep an eye on my blog, on my tweets, and I hope we can talk a bit more later.
Absolutely. Wouldn't have it any other way. All right, folks. Everyone say thank you so much to Dr. Bill Mitchell. Dr. Bill Mitchell, thank you again from Real Progressives. You've been most gracious with your time. Tell your lovely wife we said thank you for letting us borrow you, and we'll talk to you soon.
I'm borrowing her Facebook account.
Yes, you are. All right, so we will talk to you soon. Thank you so much again. Have a great night.
Take care. See you later.
Yeah.